Our notion of life's limits has evolved greatly since we learned about the structure of DNA, and since the 70s, when this entire branch of life, the archaea, this new domain, was discovered. The archaea as a whole were first identified in very extreme environments, but it later found to be relatively ubiquitous. And one of their unique characteristics is adaptation to chronic energy stress. So relating this back to, not just archaea, but archaea and bacteria and even eukaryotes like ourselves, there are many organisms that have really adapted to extremely low energy flux, to extremely low nutrient supply. And we now know of organisms that are able to survive for hundreds of thousands of years, potentially, or have extremely slow growth and life cycles so that they can live in the deep subsurface of the ocean, or they can live kilometers down in the Earth's surface, or they can live, or at least be viable during transport through the atmosphere at potentially near stratospheric altitudes, although we don't really know what if any life is up at true stratospheric altitudes. So our notion of habitability has really expanded with the advent of molecular approaches to search for and characterize life. This is because most life is not culturable. But with these molecular tools, we've been able to say, oh, well, there's definitely life out there. We're not yet sure what it's doing or how it's doing it, but now we're able to discover that and relate it to its environment, what nutrients are available, and what are the limits on activity in these environments. So let me talk about a particular kind of adaptability, and that is in the environments the environmental metagenomics work that we're doing, we're studying terrestrial analogs of Mars. And in particular, one of the areas we're studying is an acid hydrothermal system on the flank of Volcan Copahue, an active volcano in the Andes Mountains. And so one of the questions in our mind is how is this environment being colonized? There are periodic volcanic eruptions, but how would life, say, on the early Earth, or 2 billion years ago, how would life colonize these environments? So in, I believe, 2013, there was a paper demonstrating transport of some large organisms, diatoms, which might be 10 to 100 microns, by a volcanic eruption, by a phreatic eruption in which basically magma is coming into contact with water and producing explosive events. The authors believe that these diatoms could be transported up to 800 kilometers or more and potentially in a viable state. And so one of the questions that I'm working on now is, could smaller organisms be transported to even further distances? So could this happen in a way that organisms could be transported near or even globally on Earth? And that may have helped these microbes that are colonizing these specific extreme niches in, say, very acidic environments or volcanic environments, spreading from place to place. And so we're going to try to test that empirically through comparative genomics of these different environments and trying to understand if there's a spatial relationship between their genomes, but also potentially sampling the atmosphere. And so that relates to another area, which just is what microbes are being transported in the air, and are they active or viable? And so microbes have had an association with the air, with the atmosphere for billions of years. On the early Earth, there may not have been much continental crust, and so Earth was covered in an ocean, largely, if not completely. Once the early continents began to form, microbes began to weather the continental crust and weather away metals like or iron sulfide minerals or other materials that were available, and this material would end up in the ocean. This weathering, microbes would have to get from habitable environment to habitable environment, and so what we're studying today might have implications for how this weathering process took place 2.5 billion years ago. And it was during this time when photosynthetically produced oxygen was beginning to build up, and Earth was shifting from an environment with little to no oxygen to 20% oxygen. So in that context, for microbes on the early Earth, this transition of oxidation, the Great Oxidation Event as it's called, that happened about 2.45 billion years ago, was truly extreme. It was one of the great catastrophes in the history of life on Earth. And in that context, today's environment is very extreme for many microbes. And those microbes today either adapted to this extreme oxygen level or found environments where there wasn't a lot of oxygen. And so that's why, for example, we might find those microbes. They could be in the subsurface of the ocean, but they could also be in the human gut. And so our notion of what's an extreme environment really depends on the context. For Mars, it might be what organisms can survive at 5 to 10 millibars of pressure at below freezing. We now know microbes can survive down to can actively metabolize even below -10 Celsius or even lower. Microbes make ice nucleation proteins so that it may help them survive transport in the atmosphere, for example, or it may help them get out of the atmosphere and get back and land on a plant, for example. This may be a way in which crop pathogens or other plant pathogens spread. But we also have examples of extreme organisms, in our gut, for example, these ancient organisms that could not adapt to the extreme oxygen environment. So there are limits on adaptation, but we really don't know what they are right now. We're really continuing to explore that with genetic tools that don't have the need, that don't require us to culture organisms. It's very hard to guess what are all the factors that are required to grow a given organism. There may be many signals that we cannot provide in the lab or simply don't know how to provide at the moment. Our notion of what environment is habitable has been expanding, and it generally doesn't contract because whether we find a natural microbe or whether we evolve a microbe that can adapt to a particular environment, once we've done it, it's an existence proof that life, in fact, can tolerate that extreme condition. Let's take an example. We used to think that 100 degrees C might have been an upper limit for life as we know it. But then organisms were discovered at hydrothermal vents that were capable of temperatures even up to 120 C. Over time, our notion of what are those limits has greatly expanded. And I suspect that as we continue exploring the natural world, undersea vent, high altitude microbes, low pressure if we're simulating Mars in a lab, high temperature perhaps in industrial applications or extreme concentrations of particular materials, we will further expand our notion of what is a habitable environment. And this has really deep implications for the extent to which life is common in the universe. Because we're now discovering many extrasolar planets, and we're going to start learning about what kinds of planets these might be. If we consider what might be a habitable planet, and our notion of habitable planets is, does it have liquid water on the surface? Does it look like the Earth, etc.? This may be a really poor basis for evaluating whether what's the quantity and quality of habitability in the universe. In fact, it may be, we now know life can survive for kilometers into the crust. We're starting to get a notion of environments like seafloor vents, say an alkaline vent. That's probably the most plausible case for the origin of life, would be at an alkaline vent with an acidic ocean. But we now know there are subsurface oceans on Europa and Enceladus and maybe other places in our own solar system, let alone habitable worlds in other star systems which may not look like Earth, but may have subsurface environments that are very similar to Earth. And in that context, it may dramatically expand our notion of habitability. So if we were to find life beyond Earth, say somewhere else in the solar system, that could help us have an existence proof, particularly if it's not related to life on Earth, that life is likely to be common in the universe. And so I think that's a key notion. We're expanding our notions of habitability, and once we have more than an N of 1, we will have a sense of how common life is in the universe.